So, did anybody do the reading of Acts 6? Just not trying to shame anybody if you didn't. But what I'd like to start off with is if anything jumped out to anybody specifically.
I must
That would be a
confess,
very interactive Bible.
since I was not here last week, I did not do my homework this week. So,
Hey, George, may I make a suggestion? Because I know I didn't know you were going to be teaching on Acts 6, so it might be a good idea if we read Acts 6.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody want to volunteer?
Yeah, I think Mitch just volunteered, as I understood it.
Well, thanks for volunteering me there, David. But
Oh, I thought that's what you were doing.
no, I'm fine. I can read Acts 6. So let me.
What did was there an idea or was something said on what people thought I was teaching on today?
no.
Okay, got it.
So I had taught from Acts 5, but then Lee had taught on Elul. So I don't know that was an expectation of sequence. I know
No, that's fine. I was under the impression for some reason that you taught Acts 5 last week, so I've been under that. Yeah.
No worries, George. So, okay, here's Acts chapter 6. I'm reading from the NIV. In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and will give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the word." This proposal pleased the whole group. They chose Stephen, a man full of faith in the Holy Spirit, also Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas from Antioch, a convert to Judaism. They presented these men to the apostles, who prayed and laid their hands on them. So the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, performed great wonders and signs among the people. Opposition arose, however, from members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia, who began to argue with Stephen. But they could not stand up against the wisdom the Spirit gave him as he spoke. Then they secretly persuaded some men to say, "We have heard Stephen speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God." So they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. They seized Stephen and brought him before the Sanhedrin. They produced false witnesses who testified, "This fellow never stopped speaking against the holy place and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs of Moses handed down to us." All who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel.
Thank you very much, Mitch.
Sure.
So, does anything stand out from that and catch anybody's attention? And it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
I know that but one second, David. Before David speaks, I just want to point out that I know that at Dust we've been walking through Acts as a field guide against oppression and empire. And so just because nobody knew that I was teaching on Acts 6 and Mitch was just nice enough to read, if it's not related to that, that's not a problem. I'm just curious, like, what sticks out with people to start. So go ahead, David. Thank you.
I was just going to say, it sounds like Stephen, I mean, this is a spoiler alert, but he's about to get screwed.
Great. Thanks for ruining the Bible for me, David. Actually, I was wondering if anybody knows the difference between the Hellenistic and the Hebraic Jews if somebody could give me a refresher on that, because that starts right off with that. So
Absolutely. So the Hellenists were Greek Jews and had the Septuagint, the Greek translation. And there was, and Mitch, please correct me if I'm wrong or I'm forgetting anything on this, but there was a little bit of tension with culture between the Hellenistic and the Hebraic Jews. But also there was this kind of weird hierarchy that was present, as in, the idea being that the Hebraic Jews, because they lived in Israel from, Jerusalem and all that, not a part of the diaspora, were kind of doing it right a little more than the Hellenistic. Mitch, am I remembering correctly?
So you want to get it?
Yeah, you're good on that, George.
So anything else stand out to anybody?
Yeah, I caught that too, Amanda. And I don't think we'd really even heard until now much about anyone outside of Jerusalem being part of the church, And so I was wondering, like, okay, were these Hellenistic Jews in Jerusalem, like ones that had, were in Jerusalem but had become part of the Jewish faith, in the in Greece, or in the outside of Israel itself. Another thing that stuck out to me was, in all of the English translations I've heard, just kind of the harshness of the in verse 2, it is not right that we should neglect the word of God in order to wait on tables. It just seems like such a, like, George was talking about kind of this hierarchy among Hellenistic and Hebraic Jews. This really seemed like it just struck me as a very, to my ears, almost like snobbery on the part of the apostles, especially, like, it brings to mind the Mary and Martha story, where Martha is, in the kitchen, literally waiting on tables, so that Mary can sit in learning at the feet of Jesus, the rabbi. And I know that in that story they say, Mary has chosen, quote unquote, the better way, but this seems very much more almost demeaning to that, like, practical work of being a community, in opposition to, like, the spiritual work of spreading the gospel.
Yeah, it's so Wade, absolutely. When I read that for the first time recently, when I jumped back to Acts, it was really hard for me not to read classism into that. Right? Like, this job is, well, and not only that, but what we're seeing in the first two verses is there's already some breakdown of the fulfillment of Shavuot. Not everybody's needs are being met. And the 12 are in charge of waiting on tables, and this issue is happening. And so it's like, okay, well, what's going on there?
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's already a part of church culture to kind of divide up tasks and then assign relative values to those. Like, I grew up in a Protestant culture where, you had, where we use terms like deacon and elder and pastor, and and there definitely was a hierarchy, that the pastor was at the top, and then the elders were beneath that, and then the deacons were beneath them because they did the scut work.
I think it would be really interesting to explore that verse and look at, individual words, and I obviously haven't taken the time to do that because that translation seems to be a very Western type of translation that we're looking at. It's not really, I don't think it's probably a very Eastern mindset, and it would be really interesting to look at any translations from an Eastern perspective to see what that verse of scripture says, because you're right, it's very hierarchical in the way it's presented. And I can't imagine that is the intent of Peter when he's talking, that, hey, we're better than you, we're wasting our time serving tables, because that's what we hear in Western culture. It's a waste of time for us to be
Right.
serving tables when we could be out preaching the gospel. And I can't imagine that is the intent here.
Right. And the value placed on hospitality in the culture, you would think that waiting on tables would be very high. Like if we replace that with showing hospitality instead of waiting on tables, then it really makes you think about the verse like, okay, well, it is not right that we should neglect this high priority for this other high priority. So.
Well, and I wonder if that's doing a good job of speaking to the need of balance when it comes to community as well, or not just community, but in general. So, if they're spending all of their time focusing on one aspect, which is as important to prayer and working and continuing to preach, and people are still not having their needs met. Like that's something that is, I feel like that's important to bring into this conversation too. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that makes any sense, right?
Amanda, I think you had your hand up.
Yes. So this kind of reminds me of when Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, went to visit him, and they were chatting and everything like that. And Moses was saying, this is the shiz that's going on, and people are getting restless and all that stuff. And Jethro's like, dude, you need some more people to help you out, or you're going to wear yourself and the people out. So that's kind of what this situation reminds me of a little bit, is finding people that are going to come alongside in ministry and be able to focus on some of those things and settle those grievances, because that was what Moses was doing a lot of and was wearing him out and everything. And it sounds like that's almost a very similar situation with the disciples. But
yeah, you know what? It's funny you mentioned that, because I wrote down on my paper here, Jethro. I was thinking the exact same thing, that they're trying to do too much and they're not distributing the tasks between themselves. So maybe there is a recognition that, hey, we can't do everything. We have to distribute these tasks to other people. And it says they chose other godly people. Obviously, Stephen was doing more than waiting on tables. He was out healing people and doing those kind of things as well. So basically giving people the authority to do what they need to do in order to, like you were saying, to promote and to help the community to move forward in this new venture here.
Now, I find it funny that Mitch writes down Jethro and I write down Pumbaa because they mentioned Timon.
You know what? I think I should have done that because I work at a zoo. I'm jealous. So.
And just because this is dust, that biblical reference for Jethro, not for Pumbaa, is Exodus 18.
I'm just glad that we hit a reference.
New interpretation here. So.
Oh God, yeah. I'm just glad that we were able to hit a reference that was more than 20 years old. Right, so.
Was that on your bingo card, George?
I think it was on all of our bingo cards in our heart. So
I think. Oh, sorry.
No. Please, David, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think this also has application to where dust is right now. I mean, we look at, I think, not that it's a burden, but the effort that Dom and Tana have been putting forward. And it makes me a a little sad to say that if I contributed to them needing a sabbatical, that would cause me a little, I feel a little emotional that I might have, I might not have been stepping up before, not that I'm stepping up now, but just that I wasn't supporting the work that we are trying to do in our community. I think that's something that just is, on my mind, and it just spurred that thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good thought to have. I mean, especially when we're, like you said, practically that applies. And, not to be that guy, but you probably, all of us by not stepping up contributed to the need of a sabbatical, but that's also a natural part of church work too. That's been put off for way too long, is the sabbatical that Don's on. So, David, I'm not going to absolve you of anything, but also I'd say, it's not, it's a more complex answer to a simple statement, which is both true and not true. Does that make sense? No, never mind. Okay, well, David, thank you for that contribution. I'm enjoying my first and last time teaching here. So you bring up a good point, which is the need of help from among the group of disciples that's there, right? So things are happening that are falling short, that are not up to the same level of output, I guess, as we've seen in the previous chapters up to here. And so now it's time for the disciples among themselves, not the 12, to pick people who can come alongside and do some of this hard work. And it's a really interesting mix of people that Mitch pointed out, but also Nicholas, the proselyte from Antioch. So we've got somebody who is from Greece, who converted to Judaism, who is now devoting themselves to the way. So, I just am kind of struck by I don't know, something that I've always thought was interesting about chapter 6 is it seems like we're starting to see where the breakdown happens between different cultures and ethnicities of believers. I mean, and that's something that, we see throughout the rest of Acts, and Paul is very, I don't want to say critical, but he's a leading voice in his letters and how that actually works. So before we move on to any other parts of chapter 6, does anybody else have any thoughts?
I had a thought when you bring up, Nicholas, the proselyte of Antioch, and tying it back to the first verse where they talk about the Hellenists and the Hebraic Jews. So obviously in Antioch, he was most likely, a convert to via Hellenistic Jews, And so, so part of the problem that necessitates the appointing of these deacons, or whatever they're going to be called, is like the solution is not then to have the current leadership, which is all Jews from Israel and around Jerusalem, to solve this problem. That, like you said, it's select from among yourselves, and among the people that were selected were presumably a person that was probably hearing from the other Hellenistic Jews about how their widows are not being, included in the distribution. So I think, I think that's significant. Even if we do talk about Acts as a guide, that like like in the disability community, there's a slogan, nothing about us without us, so that it's not imposing solutions from the outside in, but saying, we have to be part of coming up with the solution. And so if we're, so if we are, it's, that it has to come from the change in the community and of challenging empire have to come from the oppressed community as well. It can't just be say, I'm freeing you from your oppression on your behalf, but I myself am not directly impacted by that oppression. So it just strikes me that that the solutions, when they recognize inequities in their own community, they're also addressing those, and not just I guess there's oppression within and outside of movements. And so you might be fighting against an outside oppressor, but then when you recognize something within your own movement that needs correction, you need to go to the people within your movement that are being treated unequally, and include them in the process of making the changes you need to make.
So I'm really happy that you said that, Wade, because one of the questions that popped out to me when I was reading and trying to prepare for this was, are we seeing the church succumb to its own type of empire? In these earliest verses of chapter 6, are we starting to see unintentionally the church build hierarchy potentially, but also importantly succumb to or create its own form of empire by not providing for all?
Well, George, if that wasn't a rhetorical question, and I don't believe it was.
Thanks, Mitch.
Yeah, sure. I think there's always a danger of that, and and we see it today in spades, to be honest with you, is that there's always the danger that the church incorporates the culture of empire in order to achieve its goals. I mean, if you go down further, it talks about the freedmen. That's another whole issue. Okay, so those are freed slaves who have a certain social standing. And so they're now threatening the new movement. And so, Stephen stands up against that, obviously arguing theologically with them. They can't get their point across. So basically they use other tactics in order to continue their social status.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mitch, I'm glad that you brought that part up, because so when I was reading that, one of the things that jumped to mind are, how many times have people called the cops on people of color and used empire in their favor to stop somebody who wasn't doing anything wrong? The 911 phone call in Central Park a few months back comes to mind, of the bird watcher who asked this woman to put her dog on a leash because it was in an area that was not supposed to be. And she's coming up with, or she says that there's a black man threatening her life. And, we're seeing these freed slaves who were under the thumb of empire now acting as agents of empire, maybe not directly involved with it anymore because they're free, but still acting in its favor.
George, I think that the line becomes so blurred sometimes, is that there's a opinion, and I think this happens here in Western culture, particularly United States, is that empire is Christianity. All right, so our way of life is the way. Okay, so the capitalist system, the system of democracy that we have, this is what the kingdom of God's going to look like. So yeah, I mean, the two become so intermixed that we can't even tell the difference between the two.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Or should I just say thoughts? Is it thoughts that gets the bingo card, or is it any thoughts?
Either one.
Okay.
We're very liberal here.
Did somebody say liberal? I think I have that on my bingo card.
Say, yeah, I saw you shoot up, David. But no, I mean, this is, I feel like Act 6, even though it's extremely short as far as the chapter lengths go in this book, it's extremely pivotal because we start to see some of these black and white lines become kind of gray.
Well, can we clarify if it's possible? I mean, it says opposition arose from members of the synagogue of the freedmen. And I don't know, is that within the church as it was, or is that just because Stephen was preaching in Jewish public places and these folks were arguing with him? They weren't necessarily Christians, although that term wasn't then there. Because I wasn't sure about that, because I find it ironic that, you know, they're probably trying to argue with him regarding theology, doctrine, whatever, point to the law, and then they go and break the law to bring false witness against him.
So, Amanda, that's definitely fair. From everything that I've read and from what I understand, and Mitch, I'm sure you can weigh in on this too, is those were people who were not members of the way. And so they were arguing, they were members of a type of Jewish synagogue in the area that were arguing against Stephen.
I wonder, just in keeping with the kind of the author's focus in this chapter, whether part of this, of specifically mentioning this synagogue of freedmen, number one, points out that kind of culturally among the Jewish people at this time, I mean, there was the temple still, so they weren't all just worshiping in synagogues. So it wasn't so much worshiping that happens in synagogues as kind of teaching and readings and such. But this points out that the freedmen had their own synagogue and weren't integrated into the rest of the synagogues in Jerusalem, you know. So I'm wondering, and the places that they talk about, you know, would be consistent with like Hellenistic Jews as well. You know, so whether this is kind of a continuation of kind of looking at this this split between Hebraic and Hellenistic Jews, both within the church and within the bigger culture, you know, and so was the synagogue, like you pointed out, if the Hellenistic Jews used the Septuagint instead of the Hebrew Bible, was that why there was kind of a separate synagogue for the freedmen? Because most of them would have been Greek fluent, and therefore their teaching and such would be in Greek. You know, so I just, you know, like the way that the author kind of puts this together, we kind of keep seeing it come up again, that there were kind of these cultural distinctions that created potential cultural inequities, you know. And so I like what you said about, like, you know, in chapter 6, it really kind of shows, you know, what the culture at large is and how that eventually, if not addressed, is going to become the culture of the church or be co-opted by that. And so, so I just thought that was interesting. I also thought was interesting in verse 7, I just noticed that it says a great many of the priests became obedient to the truth. And so, like, we see these verses where it says basically continue to spread, increasing numbers, and a great many of people convert, and so it's kind of like it punctuates Acts. We've seen it, I think this is at least the third time we've seen something like that. And 3,000 were added to their number, that day or whatever. But this is the first time that it kind of specifically says, and the priests, a significant numbers were from priests, which I think it reminds me that I often think of the church as being Christians versus Jews, or the Jewish establishment, and not just as a certain way of being Jewish in the first century in the Middle East, So.
Yeah. So to your beginning question, the idea is, yes, these the Synagogue of the Freedmen were most likely, I should say, the general consensus among most scholars about the Synagogue of the Freedmen is they were most likely Greek-speaking, Hellenized, either converts or people who were part of a diaspora who were sent back to Jerusalem after their time as a slave was done.
Well, one thing is that, they had a secret council that was reminiscent going back to the Gospels. Okay, Luke wrote Acts, Luke wrote, obviously, the Gospel of Luke. Okay, so secret meetings, secret trials. In the case of Messiah and with Stephen, so kind of the same modus operandi, false accusations. And basically, I think it was the same accusation against Christ as well as it was against Stephen.
Yeah, and then what will end up being the same accusations against Jesus's brother James too, speaking against Moses and God. So I guess it's technically a hat trick, right? Are sports references on the bingo card? Because that's hockey.
I think that actually makes you remove a chip from your card if you make a sports reference.
That's fair.
Well, I think it's interesting, Mitch, when you I'm all about looking at the text as something that's authored by a person that has certain intentions of how they're going to write this. And so when you talk about how, the author is very clearly writing this to call back to Christ, and so, this looks very much like, meeting with Judas to plan this setup, to make accusations of blasphemy, to kind of bring them before, Jewish authorities. And then, spoiler alert, the whole description of what happens to Stephen uses exact words from Christ of saying, receive my spirit. And, and after saying this, he dies, so it's very much, I think, intentional that we get to read Stephen as we read the story of Christ's betrayal and crucifixion, and so yeah, I think in the next chapter, like this chapter and the next chapter, I think it's interesting to say, well, what is the author then saying about the church, about Stephen? I think it is interesting that it is not like Peter that gets this treatment. So it's not the leader of the way movement or kind of the spokesman for this that gets set up as the second place that we see that story. It's Stephen. And I'm also thinking, like, even in the Gospels, where the Gospels that have Christ in the foot washing ceremony, of talking about serving and servanthood, and setting that up as an attribute of Christ, and then obviously Stephen is set up as being one that serves at the table, one that is in the business of not preaching the gospel, but doing the gospel. Providing safety, providing food security, providing income, providing whatever it is that people need. That's the deacon's job. And so what does it say about Christ that it's Stephen and not Peter that gets set up as where we get the repeat of the Christ story for the early church? So.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you bring up, Wade. I'm gonna have to sit on that for a while and think about it. I'd never thought about it in that context, or that being a thought. Because so when you were talking about that, one of the things that I was thinking about, or that kind of sparked from what you were saying, is how can we do the work of the church and ensure that we don't create a sub-empire? Like, what are the questions we can be asking ourselves? What are the things that we can do, the ways or people we can put in place to say, make sure that you're calling us out, or that we're not coming into an area and, because the church has a habit of colonizing and going into places and saying, here's what's wrong, here's what we need to do to fix it. But we see the first grouping of the church, and the question that I start to ask is, how sustainable is this before it becomes empire? And 6 seems to be throwing up these kind of, I don't know if I'd say red flags, but they're definitely maybe yellow, little orange, on their way to becoming red. So what can we do, not just as Dust, but individually, to say, okay, well, how can we ensure that we're not going to repeat the same mistakes as Empire does?
Really interesting question, George. And one, obviously, that we're going to wrestle with until Messiah returns, to be honest with you. But, I'll do one better than you, Wade, about spoiler alert. Okay, so I got to zoom up to the letters of Paul. Okay, so the epistles. So basically, nearly all of the epistles address the same issue. So Paul was addressing the same issue. So to the Corinthians, okay, how can we keep from becoming empire? And I think Paul sums it all up, in all honesty, in chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians. How can we make sure that we don't become empire? And that is, we have to surround everything with love of neighbor and love of God. We said it this morning with Shema. So that has to surround everything we do. And I think that was Paul's basic message in all of his letters to the various churches, is that, like, giftedness, it's great, but your giftedness has to be surrounded in love and not by hierarchy, like we were talking about before. So if you speak in tongues, or you're a prophet, it's wonderful, but you know what? That is not the end all of end alls. It's our attitude and our treatment of other people that really dictates who we are as Christian people, as God followers.
Yeah, That's some good. That's some good point, Smitch. Amanda said that she's going to have to duck out, and we've got about 8 minutes left before time. Is there anything else any other thoughts before we kind of wrap up and go into prayer requests?
Yes, I am sort of leaning toward, as I'm looking at the broader overview of this chapter and thinking about who's reading this and what we're talking about with classism. I think one of the interesting pieces of this is that you can view it in that, how do we prevent classism? But I think it actually shows you how to do that exactly in the text. And when Stephen is appointed by this council, along with the other men, what's interesting is those other men are no longer mentioned as being effective or for any of the work that they're doing in this chapter. What's mentioned is that Stephen is noticed, and that the work that he is doing, which is the work we have agreed is kingdom work, is actually flipping the classism on its head through servanthood in its own way. So I think the answer is right here already. Like, it is through service and through not recognizing yourself as too good to serve in the work that is kingdom work. Like, it doesn't say the council's doing kingdom work, and it doesn't say that they're better because they're sitting on some committee, or that they donated to the right people, or et cetera, et cetera. It says that Stephen is the one who is seized because he is the one doing the work that threatens empire.
Yeah, I see, Jet, what you're saying about, we start the chapter with kind of creating two distinct classes of those that do, those that serve the word and those that serve the table, and I don't know that it's, to me, I don't know that it is necessarily to say, oh, well, see, it's those that serve the table that are actually most effective, because in in 8, when they talk about Stephen, full of grace and power, did great wonders and signs among the people, they're basically using the same description of Peter in a previous chapter, where people would bring out their sick just so that Peter's shadow would pass over them, and so it's kind of saying that God's power and grace isn't a function of whether you serve, quote unquote, the word as a preacher or at the table, that God's power is shown in both of these kind of distinctions that we have set up. But the reason that they set up that whole new group of people was, like you said, George, because they saw that needs weren't being met. But yeah, I think it is interesting, Jed, that we never really hear specifics about how those people that were chosen to that new task, like how they carried that out. We don't see how God's grace and power were shown through having people specifically designated to serve in that way, in addition to people that were designated to serve as apostles. So I think it's interesting. Like, the only thing that I see that rather than describe how what they did was different, the description Luke gives us is how Stephen, as kind of leader of those people, is given the same miraculous power to do signs and miracles that the apostles are, And so kind of reinforces that it's a different group, but it's not a lower group than the apostles.
Yeah, I think those are a lot of really good points. Also, this is not related at all to the teaching, but I would just like to point everybody's attention to the second picture of David Kissinger, the one that he normally has on video. It is honestly spectacular. Okay, so we are almost at time. We've got 2 minutes left. Does anybody else have any thoughts or ideas before we pass it over to Wade for prayer requests? Okay, well.
I'm sorry. It took me a long time to turn my mute off.
It's okay. Go ahead, Tally.
And I feel like, where's my camera? I feel like I should let myself be seen if I'm going to say things. But I don't see myself. Can you see me? Oh, there I am. Hi. So I just was thinking, I didn't say this earlier when Mitch was talking, but that's when I thought of it. But I felt like it didn't really go with the flow, so that's why I didn't interrupt. But I think about how, we can only guess what different thoughts and feelings that people would come into, their quote unquote church experience at that time. But I think for us now, at least in Dust, like we try to be really mindful of people having past experiences with churches that would mimic hierarchy and what different sort of, or that would have a hierarchy that would possibly mimic empire, or create their own, try to, we're mindful of that because we don't want that to be the experience, and we don't want anybody's job, or place at church to be seen as less than any other. But even with us being mindful of that, we still, I think, can fall into some of those thought patterns that this is important and that's not important. That's all I was thinking. I don't have a real good point. Like I'm not solving it. Sorry. But when Mitch was talking, I was thinking about how, even at a place where we're mindful of that, now I would think that it's possible, but who even knows, that we have a church that also has, a lot of people who have baggage from other church experiences. So it's really something to combat against for us. So yeah, I don't think we're failing. I'm not saying that. I think we're largely succeeding so far in not creating that sort of feeling, based upon the different tasks or roles that people do. But I was just thinking about that. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, you stirred up something. One of the things Don and I talk about pretty often is how do you remove the power from the pulpit so that the power is equal amongst all people. And this is a chapter where it's like, it seems like they're putting more power back into the pulpit with the apostles stepping away from serving tables. And so it's like, how do you reconcile that? It's not that it's not important that prayer and doing the work of the text, but how do you make sure that stays on the same level as working the tables? Like, where's the balance in that?
Right.
Which I think is a good thing for us to wrestle with through the week. Go ahead, Wade.
And I think part of the way Luke, or the author of the text, addresses that is the point that Stephen is never explicitly shown serving tables. He's explicitly shown preaching the gospel, and so to say, like part of the way that we decentarize the person that's preaching the gospel is to show that no matter what their role, salvation is being done, that, and the empire is being challenged, um, I wanted to call back to something David Kissinger talked about, and just, this was my thought too when I first read this, when I was preparing to discuss 5, I read into 6 because, chapter divisions are artificial. And so as I was, doing that, I was thinking, like David said, this is really pertinent for our community during the sabbatical, where we look and we say, like, whose responsibility is it to do the work of the community? Does it fall on one person? Does it fall on a small group of people? Or how does that, how is that done in community? And like you were talking about, George, in terms of decentralizing the pulpit work. And, I think in Dust, we've always strived to say, let's put as many experiences at the front of the church as possible, because, especially in a church with a single, designated pastoral person, that person's experience does not reflect the full life of the church and the full experience of the people in the church, and so being able to speak, Tally talks about people, about in Dust, how people come from different experiences of hierarchy and empire in church, and I can't speak to what it is like to be a woman in a church, but I was raised in a, in a mainline Protestant church, that that particular synod would not, I don't think, would not ordain women, but to me, that was just what I was raised in. And so I couldn't come before Dust and speak to the kind of the psychology of that experience and what it does to one, so I think, I think David is right to kind of say, oh, this is a good eye-opener during sabbatical of how much we need this, but I think it's also a great opportunity to say, hey, in order to make this work, we need someone to manage technical aspects on Zoom. We need someone to kind of manage the flow of the of kind of just what we consider our liturgy, and make sure that we stay on time. And we need people that are willing to lead a discussion, and the great thing about how we do things in Dust, and I'll get off my soapbox soon, but is that the way we lead a discussion means that it doesn't matter who's quote unquote up front, because all experiences are invited to take their place up front, even in the discussion, so, George, that you invite us to share what we see in the text, because that's going to be influenced by our background and our experiences, and and you may have not seen any of it, not seen what we each bring to that. It's one of the things that I love about Dust. Oh, Craig, we don't end at 11:30, so just pipe down. So anyway, I think as we think about this in relationship to our own community, and removing hierarchy from our community, we can also think about how God can show His grace and power through you, you know, whether Don's on sabbatical or not. So
Absolutely. Wait, yeah. And you and Tally brought up some really good points. And with what David said, I'm glad I get a second chance to kind of address kind of the guilt he was feeling about, you know, what leading Don and Tana to take the sabbatical right now. And, you know, the truth is, when you're so used to power being at the pulpit and a weird sense of community, of it being, you know, you show up on Sundays and then you get into a church like Dust and you're trying to do things differently. Individually, we can fall back on our old habits. And to say we collectively have a part in checking in with the person who is in charge of the Zoom operations and Don, who is the designated pastor of the church. But, you know, the surface level of, hey, how are you doing? Is everything okay? And trying to break through that on a weekly basis and saying, do you need a break, is a really difficult thing to do. Especially, you know, when we all have our individual lives that are extremely stressful and full of other things. And, you know, I'm honored to have been able to sit before you all and help facilitate the discussion on Acts 6, because it's a great reminder, okay, well, how do we ensure that we are taking equal stake in community in a healthy way and ensuring that we don't become our own type of empire? If that does that make more sense this time? Okay, cool. Whatever. Anyway, I'm done with anything that I had. So Wade, I'm gonna pass it over to you for prayers.
okay.